Counsel, control your client. She's a bookkeeper, for God's sake. She wouldn't know an estate from a grocery list. My father said it loud enough for the whole courtroom to hear, and then he smiled. Not a nervous smile, a satisfied one. The kind a man wears when he believes he has already won and is only waiting for everyone else to notice. I can still tell you exactly what that room smelled like. Old paper and floor wax, and underneath it the cold metallic smell that air conditioning gets when it has been running too hard against a Charleston August. A ceiling fan turned slowly above the judge's bench even though the AC was on, the way it does in old southern courthouses where nobody trusts the machines completely. Somewhere behind me, a chair creaked. A woman near the doors coughed once and then went very still, the way people go still when they sense something is about to happen. There were 19 people in that gallery. I counted them later, the way I count everything. Family. A few of my father's friends from the club. A reporter from the Post and Courier who had heard there was money involved. My younger brother Spencer, sitting in the second row in a suit that cost more than my car, studying his cufflinks like they were the most fascinating things he had ever seen. My father turned in his chair to make sure I had heard him. He wanted to see my face. He had spent 47 years waiting to see my face fold, and he thought today was the day. I looked back at him, and I did not say anything. My name is Claire Hale Bellamy. I am 47 years old, and that morning, in a probate courtroom in downtown Charleston, my own father stood up and told a judge that I was a fraud, a manipulator, and a thief who had preyed on a confused old woman to steal a house and a company that, he said, belonged to him. Counsel, control your client. She's a bookkeeper, for God's sake. She wouldn't know an estate from a grocery list. My father said it loud enough for the whole courtroom to hear, and then he smiled. Not a nervous smile, a satisfied one. The kind a man wears when he believes he has already won and is only waiting for everyone else to notice. I can still tell you exactly what that room smelled like. Old paper and floor wax, and underneath it the cold metallic smell that air conditioning gets when it has been running too hard against a Charleston August. A ceiling fan turned slowly above the judge's bench even though the AC was on, the way it does in old southern courthouses where nobody trusts the machines completely. Somewhere behind me, a chair creaked. A woman near the doors coughed once and then went very still, the way people go still when they sense something is about to happen. There were 19 people in that gallery. I counted them later, the way I count everything. Family. A few of my father's friends from the club. A reporter from the Post and Courier who had heard there was money involved. My younger brother Spencer, sitting in the second row in a suit that cost more than my car, studying his cufflinks like they were the most fascinating things he had ever seen. My father turned in his chair to make sure I had heard him. He wanted to see my face. He had spent 47 years waiting to see my face fold, and he thought today was the day. I looked back at him, and I did not say anything. My name is Claire Hale Bellamy. I am 47 years old, and that morning, in a probate courtroom in downtown Charleston, my own father stood up and told a judge that I was a fraud, a manipulator, and a thief who had preyed on a confused old woman to steal a house and a company that, he said, belonged to him. What my father did not know, what he could not have known, because he had never once in his life been curious about anything I did, was that the document sitting in my attorney's folder had been signed 17 years earlier by his own mother in her own hand. While she was sharper than he ever was on his best day, he thought he was there to take the estate from me. He had no idea he had been living in my house for the last 4 years, and that I was the only reason he still had a roof. By the time that hearing was over, every person in that room would understand exactly who Gerald Hale really was. But to make you understand why I sat there silent while my father called me a thief, and why I let him keep going, I have to take you back, not to the courtroom, to a kitchen and a brass key and a grandmother who saw all of this coming long before I did. Before I tell you what happened next, do me one small favor. Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. I read every single one, and if you've ever sat quiet while someone who shares your blood decided out loud that you were nothing, stay with me. This one is for you. I grew up in a house called Ashburn, on the marsh side of the Charleston Peninsula, where the Spartina grass turns gold in October, and the tide comes in so slow you can watch a whole afternoon disappear into the creek. The house was built in 1911 by my great-great-grandfather, who started a little title and surveying outfit that eventually became Hale Land and Title Company. For most of the 20th century, if a piece of land changed hands in 3 low-country counties, a Hale had touched the paperwork. The family liked to talk about that history at dinner parties. We liked the word estate. We liked the oil portrait of old Augustus Hale in the front hall and the brass plate on the company door downtown. What the family did not like to talk about was that for the last 30 years, the only person who actually held that whole thing together was a 5'1" woman named Adelaide, my grandmother, Della, to the few people she allowed to call her that. Della took over Hale Land and Title in 1979, after her husband died, and after everyone assumed she would sell. She did not sell. She put on reading glasses, learned the books, fired 2 men who had been quietly skimming, and ran that company with a fountain pen and a memory like a bear trap until she was almost 90. She wore the same 3 cardigans in rotation and drove a 1994 Buick she refused to replace because she said it still ran, and she was not a fool. She terrified my father. My father is Gerald Hale. By the time you meet him properly in this story, he is 74, silver-haired, tan in February, the kind of handsome that ages into a man who has never once doubted he deserves the best table. Gerald was Della's only son, and he spent his whole life mistaking being her heir for being her equal. He had a title at the company, vice president, then president after she retired, which mostly meant the brass plate got a second name added to it. He had the office with the good window. He had the membership at the yacht club and the standing reservation at the steakhouse on East Bay. What he did not have was the thing he wanted most, which was the feeling of being the man his mother trusted. Because she didn't. And on some animal level, he knew it. Then there's my brother. Spencer is 4 years younger than me, and from the day he was born, he was the son the whole family orbited. Spencer was charming. Spencer was fun. Spencer got into a good school, and then a better one, and then a string of business ideas that always sounded brilliant at Thanksgiving and quietly died by Easter. A wine importing thing. A boutique real estate fund. A wellness hospitality concept in Costa Rica that cost my father $200,000 and produced a single unfinished bungalow and a lawsuit. Every time Spencer fell, the family caught him, dusted him off, and told the story like it had been bad luck. And then there was me. I was the quiet one, the serious one. The one who, when I told my father at 19 that I wanted to be a forensic accountant, watched him laugh into his bourbon and say, "So, you want to be a glorified calculator?" For the next 28 years, that was the family joke. Claire counts other people's pennies. Claire does the boring math. At dinner, if anyone asked what I did, my father would answer for me. "Oh, Claire moves decimal points around." And everyone would chuckle, and I would refill the water glasses, because that was my role. And I had played it for so long, I had stopped noticing the script. I want to be honest with you about something, because the easy version of this story makes me the saint, and that isn't true. I let it happen. For decades, I told myself it was love, or patience, or keeping the peace. Some of it was. But some of it was that it is easier to be underestimated than to be a disappointment, and I had built a whole quiet life inside that gap. I married a man who never once underestimated me. Daniel taught high school band, played a battered upright bass in a jazz trio on weekends, and looked at me across a room like I was the most interesting thing that had ever walked into it. We had a daughter, Maddie, who got Daniel's laugh and my stubbornness, which I'm told is a dangerous combination. Daniel died of pancreatic cancer in the spring of 2021. He was 49. From the diagnosis to the funeral was 11 weeks. I am a person who measures things, and I will tell you that 11 weeks is both the longest and the shortest amount of time I have ever lived through. After he was gone, I couldn't keep our house. The grief and the medical bills and the silence were too much in those rooms. And my grandmother, Della, who was 86 by then and still sharp, called me on a Tuesday and said, in that flat voice that did not invite argument, "There's a cottage on the Ashbourne grounds. It's been empty since the gardener retired. You and Madeline are going to live in it. I've already had the gas turned on. Don't fuss." So we moved into the little cottage at the edge of my family's estate. Maddie learned to crab off the dock. Della taught her to play gin rummy for pennies and let her win exactly often enough to keep her interested. And for 4 years, in the long shadow of that big house, I rebuilt a life out of small, ordinary, honest pieces. My father did not love this arrangement. He never said so directly, but he had ways of letting you know. Let me give you the receipt, not the dramatic version, the itemized one, because the small things are how you actually learn what a family thinks of you. The first item is the money. In 2012, when I was opening my own forensic practice, I went to my father, not for a gift, for a loan, with a written agreement and an interest rate I had calculated myself. $18,000 to cover startup costs. He looked at my business plan for about as long as it takes to look at a menu, slid it back across the desk, and said, "Claire, sweetheart, I'm not going to throw good money after a hobby." Then, 8 months later, he wired Spencer $90,000 for the Costa Rica bungalow without a single page of paperwork. When I found out, my mother, who was still alive then, patted my hand and said, "Spencer needs more help than you do, honey. You've always landed on your feet." As if landing on your feet were a character flaw. The second item is the funeral. When Daniel died, my father came to the service. He wore a beautiful gray suit and shook a lot of hands and was, by every account, charming. He did not call me afterward. Not that week. Not that month. The first time we spoke after the funeral, 6 weeks later, it was because he wanted to know if I could look at a small tax question for him for free. I did it. Of course I did it. I was the strong one. The strong one doesn't get to need anything. The third item is smaller, and it is the one that still gets to me. Maddie's 10th birthday, here at Ashbourne, on the back lawn. My father showed up 40 minutes late, stayed 20 minutes, gave her a card with a $100 bill in it, and on his way out, the door said to me, in front of 3 other parents, "She's got your seriousness, poor thing. Let's hope she's got Spencer's personality." He laughed. The other parents did that thing where they smile and pretend they didn't hear. Maddie heard. She didn't say anything. She just got quieter for the rest of the afternoon, and I have never quite forgiven him for that, because hurting me was an old habit, but hurting her was new. There were 100 more. The Christmas he introduced me to a business associate as my daughter, the bean counter. The time he forgot to invite me to his 70th birthday dinner and then acted wounded that I hadn't come. The way he talked over me at every family meeting about the company, even though I was the only person in the room who could actually read a balance sheet. The way he called me dramatic on the rare occasions I pushed back. A word he never once used for Spencer, who once flipped a golf cart into the club's koi pond. And here's the one I think about most, because it's the closest I ever came to seeing the whole thing clearly, years before I had to. It was a family meeting at the company. Della was there in one of her cardigans, very quiet, and my father was presenting some plan to unlock the value of the marshland. He had glossy renderings. He had a man from a bank, and I sat there looking at his numbers and I noticed, the way I always notice, that they didn't add up. The acreage he was describing didn't match the acreage on the deed in the binder. It was off by about 60 acres. I raised my hand and I said gently, "Dad, the parcel sizes here don't match the recorded plat. Where'd these come from?" The room went quiet. My father looked at me for a long second and then he smiled and said, "Claire, honey, leave the land to the people who understand land. You stick to your calculator." Everyone laughed. The man from the bank laughed. And I looked down at my own hands and I let it go. I want you to understand. I knew. Some part of me knew right then that he was rounding things in his favor, that the numbers were being made to say what he wanted, that there was something underneath the glossy renderings that wouldn't survive being looked at. I knew, and I let it go, because being right would have made me the difficult one. And I had spent my whole life not being the difficult one. I have thought about that afternoon 1,000 times since. If I'd pushed then, maybe none of the rest would have happened. But Della caught my eye across the table, and she gave me the smallest shake of her head. Not yet. I didn't understand it then. I understand it now. She wasn't telling me I was wrong. She was telling me it wasn't time. And through all of it, the one person who saw me was Della. My grandmother was not a warm woman in the way people mean when they say warm. She didn't gush. She didn't hand out praise, but she watched. God, she watched everything. And about 3 years before all this began, it was a January afternoon I remember, because the marsh had that bleached winter look. She called me up to the big house for tea, which was unusual, and told Maddie to go feed the chickens so the grown women could talk. She had a small box on the kitchen table. Inside it was a brass key, old, the kind that opens a safe deposit box, and a plain white envelope sealed with wax, which I thought was very Della. "Claire," she said, "I want you to take this and put it somewhere safe and forget about it." I asked her what it was. "It's an answer," she said, "to a question that hasn't been asked yet. When it gets asked, and it will, you'll take this key to Francis Aldridge's office, and you'll open the box. And you'll do what makes sense to you. You're the only one in this family who's ever made sense to me." I asked her. Of course I asked her. What question? What box? What was she talking about? And she put her dry little hand over mine and said, "Your father is going to do something stupid and cruel someday, because that's the only kind of stupid he knows how to be. When he does, you're going to need to know that I saw it coming, and that I chose you. I have always chosen you. I just couldn't say so out loud while I was alive, or your father would have made everyone's life a misery." She smiled. "I'm a coward about peace, Claire, but I'm not a coward about paper." I took the key home. I put it in my dresser drawer, under the scarves, and I'm ashamed to say I half forgot about it. Grief does that. You file things away to deal with later, and later keeps not coming. Della died on a Sunday morning in June of last year. She was 90. The hospice nurse said she went easy, in her own bed, with the windows open and the tide coming in. Maddie and I had had dinner with her 2 nights before, and she'd beaten Maddie at gin 3 hands running, and told her she'd gone soft. I thought losing her would be the hardest part of that summer. It turned out losing her was the moment my father had been waiting for his entire life, and the question Della told me would someday be asked. He asked it 9 days after we buried her. The will reading was at Francis Aldridge's office on Broad Street, in a conference room with a long mahogany table and tall windows and the particular hush of a place where serious money has been discussed politely for 100 years. Francis Aldridge was Della's attorney for over 40 years. She was somewhere in her 70s, small and upright, with reading glasses on a chain, and the calm of a woman who has watched a great many families behave badly and is no longer surprised by any of it. My father came in like he owned the building. He sat at the head of the table, of course he did, with Spencer on his right and a second man I didn't recognize on his left. Expensive haircut, expensive watch, a smile that didn't reach anywhere near his eyes. My father introduced him as Roland, my attorney, in the tone of a man showing off a new car. I should have understood right then. You don't bring your own litigation attorney to a will reading unless you're planning to fight. Francis read the will. It was simple, and it was clear. Adelaide Hale left her personal effects divided between her grandchildren. She left a sum to her church and a sum to the Low Country Land Trust she'd quietly supported for years. And she left the residue of my estate, including my interest in Ashburn and in Hale Land and Title Company, to be administered according to the terms of the Adelaide W. Hale Family Trust, dated March 2009. My father's face did something complicated. "The what trust?" he said. Frances looked at him over her glasses. "The trust your mother established in 2009, Gerald. You were sent notice at the time." "I don't recall any trust." He said it the way men say things they intend to make true by saying them. He turned to Roland. Roland leaned in and murmured something, and my father's jaw set. And then he did the thing that started all of it. He laughed. "Well," he said, settling back, looking around the table, looking, finally, at me. "We'll be contesting all of this, naturally. My mother was 90 years old. She hadn't been herself in years. And we all know who's been living in her pocket, whispering in her ear, isolating her from her own family." His eyes landed on me and stayed there. "Claire moved onto the property, what, 4 years ago? Conveniently. Cooked the old woman dinner every night, drove her to the lawyer, and now there's a trust." He made the word sound dirty. "I think any judge is going to be very interested in how a 47-year-old bookkeeper with a failing little firm managed to talk a dying woman out of an entire estate." The room was very quiet. I want to tell you that I had a brilliant response. I didn't. I felt the blood leave my face. I felt the old script reach up and grab me. "Don't make a scene, Claire. Don't be dramatic." For a second, I was 19 again, watching him laugh into his bourbon. And then Frances Aldridge said, in a perfectly level voice, "Gerald, you're welcome to contest whatever you like. I'd only remind you that I drafted the 2009 trust myself, that your mother was examined by 2 physicians that week as a matter of routine, and that the document is, in my professional opinion, the most thoroughly witnessed instrument I have prepared in my career." She closed her folder. I'd think very carefully before I called it forgery in front of a judge. My father stood up. "We'll see what a judge thinks." He buttoned his jacket. "Oh, and Claire, the cottage. You'll need to be out by the end of the month. I'm not running a charity for grown women who can't support themselves." He smiled. "Nothing personal. It's an estate matter." He walked out. Spencer scurried after him without meeting my eyes. Roland gathered his expensive things and followed, and I sat there in that beautiful, quiet room, and I felt the floor tilt under me, and I thought very clearly the way you think when everything goes still. He's going to take everything. He's going to call her senile and call me a thief, and he is charming enough and rich enough that he might actually win. Then Frances Aldridge waited until the door clicked shut, and she looked at me, and she said something I will never forget. "Claire, did your grandmother ever give you a key?" I went cold all over. "She did," I said. "Then I think," Frances said, taking off her reading glasses, "it's time you and I had a different conversation than the one your father thinks we're having. I'll tell you what was in that box in just a second. But if you want to know what my grandmother actually hid for 17 years, and what it did to my father's face when it finally came out in that courtroom, make sure you've hit subscribe right now, because everything you think this story is about to turn completely upside down." I drove home from Broad Street with my hands at 10 and 2 and my mind going about 100 miles an hour. When I got to the cottage, I went straight to the dresser, dug under the scarves, and there it was. The little brass key, cold and ordinary in my palm, exactly where I'd left it 3 years before, on the day Della told me a question would someday be asked. The question had been asked. I drove back downtown the next morning. The box was at Carolina Heritage Bank, in the old vault on Meeting Street, and Frances came with me because the box was held jointly in the name of the trust. The trust officer, a quiet, careful man named Marcus Webb, walked us down into the cool of the vault, slid the long metal drawer out, and left us alone with it. Inside there were 3 things. The first was the original executed copy of the Adelaide W. Hale Family Trust, dated March 2009. 81 pages. Notarized. Witnessed by Frances and by 2 people I'd never heard of, and stamped with the seal of a notary who had since retired to Florida. I read it slowly, the way I read everything. And the more I read, the more still I became. In 2009, 17 years before my father stood up in court, my grandmother had transferred ownership of two things into this irrevocable trust. The first was Ashburn, the house, the land, the dock, the cottage I was sitting in. The second was 70% of the shares of Hale Land and Title Company, the controlling interest, the whole thing. My father owned none of it. He never had. What he'd been given, in a separate provision, was a life estate, the legal right to live at Ashburn and to draw an annual stipend from the trust, and a position at the company that came with a title and a salary, but no ownership and no authority to sell or borrow against a single acre. And the life estate could be terminated by the trustee for cause, waste, fraud, self-dealing. Frances had written the clause herself. The trust named Frances Aldridge as the initial trustee, and it named the successor trustee, the person who would step in upon Frances's resignation, and the primary beneficiary of the entire trust, as me, Claire Hale Bellamy, with my daughter Madeline named after me. My grandmother had given me everything, 17 years ago. And then she had sat at her kitchen table eating supper with my father every Sunday for 17 years and never said a word because she knew exactly the kind of war it would start, and she decided the war would be mine to fight at a time of my choosing, with all the evidence already locked in a vault. I'm a coward about peace, she'd told me, but I'm not a coward about paper. The second thing in the box was a letter, in her handwriting, 3 pages, and I am not going to read all of it to you because some of it is just mine. But the last line I'll share, because it's the line that put the iron back in my spine. She wrote, "They will tell you that you are too quiet to fight. Let them keep believing it until the exact moment it costs them everything. Patience isn't weakness, Claire. It's a loaded weapon you've simply chosen not to fire yet." The third thing in the box was a single page, a photocopy of a promissory note. He never had. What he'd been given, in a separate provision, was a life estate, the legal right to live at Ashburn and to draw an annual stipend from the trust, and a position at the company that came with a title and a salary, but no ownership and no authority to sell or borrow against a single acre. And the life estate could be terminated by the trustee for cause, waste, fraud, self-dealing. Frances had written the clause herself. The trust named Frances Aldridge as the initial trustee, and it named the successor trustee, the person who would step in upon Frances's resignation, and the primary beneficiary of the entire trust, as me, Claire Hale Bellamy, with my daughter Madeline named after me. My grandmother had given me everything, 17 years ago. And then she had sat at her kitchen table eating supper with my father every Sunday for 17 years and never said a word because she knew exactly the kind of war it would start, and she'd decided the war would be mine to fight at a time of my choosing, with all the evidence already locked in a vault. I'm a coward about peace, she'd told me, but I'm not a coward about paper. The second thing in the box was a letter, in her handwriting, 3 pages, and I am not going to read all of it to you because some of it is just mine. But the last line I'll share, because it's the line that put the iron back in my spine. She wrote, "They will tell you that you are too quiet to fight. Let them keep believing it until the exact moment it costs them everything. Patience isn't weakness, Claire. It's a loaded weapon you've simply chosen not to fire yet." The third thing in the box was a single page, a photocopy of a promissory note. And this is where my whole career, the one my father called moving decimal points around, walked onto the stage. It was a copy of a loan document, a $2.4 million line of credit, taken out the previous year, while Della was alive but failing. Secured against the Ashbourne property. The borrower of record was Hale Land and Title Company. The signature authorizing it, pledging the estate as collateral, was Adelaide W. Hales. Except it wasn't. I have looked at a lot of signatures in 25 years. I have testified about forged signatures in 3 states. And I knew, the second I saw it, the way you know a wrong note in a song you've heard 1,000 times, that my grandmother had not signed that document. The capital A was wrong. The pen pressure was wrong. The whole thing had the careful, traced quality that forgeries get when someone is copying instead of writing. My father had pledged a house he didn't own, a house that belonged to a trust, as collateral for $2.4 million, and he'd done it by forging his own mother's name. Della had gotten a copy somehow. She'd put it in the box. She'd been telling me, from beyond the grave, exactly where to dig. So, I dug. Here's the part the movies get wrong. They make this part fast. A montage, some dramatic music. It wasn't fast. It was 3 weeks of the most careful, patient, boring work of my life. Done at my kitchen table after Maddie was asleep, with a thermos of coffee and a legal pad, and the marsh tide sliding in and out of the dark window. Because I was now, legally, a beneficiary of the trust that owned the controlling interest in the company, I was entitled to the company's books. Francis made the demand formally, in writing, on trust letterhead, and Roland tried to stall, and Francis quoted 3 statutes at him until he stopped. The records came over on a Friday in 12 bankers' boxes, and I read every page. I want to slow down here, because the way I did this matters, and it's the part nobody in my family ever bothered to learn about my work. Forensic accounting is not adding up columns. It's reading a story that someone is actively trying to hide from you. Money leaves a trail the way a person leaves footprints across a wet lawn. They can wipe their shoes at the door, but the lawn still remembers where they walked. My whole job is reading the lawn. So I started with the lawn. I made a spreadsheet of every transaction over $10,000 from the company accounts for the last 3 years, and then I sorted them, and then I sat back and looked for the shape of a lie. Lies have a shape. Honest businesses are messy in random ways. Fraud is messy in patterns. The same vendor showing up at the same time of month, round numbers where round numbers don't belong, payments that are each just a hair under the figure that would trigger a second set of eyes. That last one is what caught my attention first. There were 9 payments to Palmetto Coastal Holdings over 14 months, and every single one of them was for an amount just below a reporting threshold I happen to know by heart. 9,900. 8,700. Never a clean 10. That's not how a real vendor invoices you. That's how a person moves money when they're hoping nobody's counting. It was frankly amateur. My father had clearly been told by someone, Roland, I'd bet, exactly where the lines were, and had then walked right up to every one of them like a man tiptoeing across a floor he's been told is wired. The trouble was, I needed more than a shape. A shape gets you a hunch. A courtroom needs a chain. So I built the chain link by link. I pulled the formation documents for Palmetto Coastal Holdings from the Secretary of State. Registered agent, Roland Price. The named member was another LLC, a thing called Beaufort Bridge Partners, and its member 2 layers down. In a filing my father almost certainly assumed no one would ever bother to unwrap, was Gerald Hale. People think a shell company hides them. What a shell company actually does is leave a paper trail with your name on it in a building you've never set foot in, waiting for someone patient enough to go get it. I went and got it. Then I needed the bank to confirm the money trail and that I could not do alone. This is where the people in your corner matter. And I want to be honest that I did not do this by myself, because the lie this whole genre tells, that the wronged woman wins all alone by sheer grit, is a lie. And it does real women a disservice. I had help. Frances had the trust's legal authority, and she used it to formally demand the records and to subpoena the bank. Marcus Webb, the quiet trust officer, walked the wire confirmations to me himself because, he told me later, he'd known my grandmother for 20 years, and he did not like being made into an unwitting accomplice. And I called Dr. Amara Okonkwo. Dr. Okonkwo is a forensic document examiner I'd worked with on 3 cases over the years. A meticulous woman who can spend 4 hours on a single capital letter and consider it time well spent. I sent her the forged loan note and 40 genuine samples of Della's handwriting, letters, checks, the inscriptions in the front of the book she gave Maddie every birthday. A week later, she called me, and I could hear in her voice that careful excitement examiners get when the evidence is clean. "Claire," she said, "whoever did this traced it. You can see the hesitation in the curve of the A. A genuine signature accelerates. It has momentum. This one was drawn. It's slow. It's a copy." She put it in writing, to a reasonable degree of professional certainty. I had my chain. There was one bad night. About 2 weeks in, I'd brought 4 of the banker's boxes to the cottage so I could work after Maddie went to bed. And on a Saturday morning, Spencer turned up at my door unannounced. "Just checking in, sis," and walked right past me, into the kitchen, where 3 of the boxes were sitting open on the table with my legal pad on top. The timeline half-built. The words, "Palmetto Coastal," circled twice in red. My heart stopped. I am not exaggerating. I felt it actually skip. Spencer glanced at the boxes. For one long second, I was sure he'd seen it. And then, because Spencer has never in his life looked closely at anything that wasn't about Spencer, he picked up an apple from my counter, took a bite, and said, "God, the lawyer stuff is so boring, isn't it? Anyway, Dad wanted me to see if you'd thought any more about just letting him handle the estate. Keep it simple." I said I was still thinking about it. He took another bite of my apple and left. I stood in my kitchen for a full minute with my hand on the counter, breathing. Then I went out the next day and bought a locking file cabinet, and I never brought a box into that house unsecured again. The near miss taught me something my father never learned. The people who underestimate you will walk right past the evidence, but only if you don't get cocky enough to leave it lying around. I'm going to tell you what I found, plainly, the way I'd lay it out for a judge. I found the $2.4 million loan. I traced where the money went. It did not go into the company. Over 14 months, in payments that were each just under the threshold that triggers extra reporting, a detail that told me my father had help from someone who knew the rules. The money flowed out of the company to a small holding company called Palmetto Coastal Holdings, LLC. I pulled the registration. Palmetto Coastal had been formed 2 years earlier. Its registered agent was Roland Price. Its sole member, hidden 2 layers down through another shell, was Gerald Hale. The money my father borrowed against a house he didn't own had gone to my father. Some of it covered a gambling debt I'll spare you the details of. Some of it had quietly papered over Spencer's latest disaster. And the largest single chunk, $800,000, had gone out as consulting fees to a company called Tidewater Development Partners. Tidewater Development Partners, it turned out, was the developer my father had been secretly negotiating with to buy the Ashbourne Marsh acreage, the same acreage my grandmother had spent 30 years protecting. He was planning to sell the trust's land to a developer, and the consulting fee was a kickback dressed up as an invoice, paid in advance, with the trust's own forged credit. He wasn't just trying to take the estate. He had already been quietly stealing it for 2 years, brick by brick, betting that no one in the family was capable of reading a balance sheet. He'd forgotten about the bookkeeper. I built the file the way I build every file. I made a timeline. I matched every dollar to a document. I subpoenaed, through Francis, with the trust's authority, the bank records that confirmed the wire trail. I had a handwriting examiner I'd worked with for years, a meticulous woman named Dr. Okonkwo, examined the loan signature against 40 genuine samples of Della's writing, and she gave me a written opinion, to a reasonable degree of professional certainty, that the signature was not authentic. I had Marcus Webb at the bank confirm in a sworn statement that the trust had never authorized any loan against Ashbourne, and that, in fact, the property could not legally be pledged by my father at all because he didn't own it. And here's the part I'm not proud of, but I'll tell you anyway. 'cause you've been honest enough to stay this long." About 2 weeks in, my father called me. He was charming. God, he could turn it on. He called to say maybe we'd all gotten off on the wrong foot. Maybe the cottage thing had come out harsher than he meant. Family is family, Claire. He suggested I drop all this trust nonsense, let him be appointed executor, and he'd see to it I was taken care of. He actually used those words. Taken care of. Like I was a dog he might remember to feed. I had a choice in that moment. I could have warned him. I could have told him I knew about the loan and given him a chance to put the money back and walk away quietly, and some part of me, the daughter part, the part that spent 47 years refilling his water glass, wanted to. Instead, I played dumb. I said, "I don't really understand all the legal parts, Dad. Francis handles that." I let my voice get small. I let him believe he was talking to the bookkeeper. And he, being who he is, relaxed and got expansive and said, and I had him on speaker with Maddie's tablet recording on the counter, which is legal in South Carolina when you're a party to the call. He said, "Good girl. Smart girl. Look, between us, that loan business is complicated grown-up stuff, and the less you poke around in the company's books, the better for everybody. Mother left things in a mess. I'm cleaning it up. Just stay in your lane and there'll be something in it for you. Stay in your lane." I said, "Okay, Dad." I hung up and I sat in my quiet kitchen and I added the recording to the file. It was the most honest thing he'd said to me in years, and he'd handed it to me himself. I should tell you why I didn't just take a settlement somewhere in those 3 weeks, because there was a version of this where I did. Roland floated one, through Francis. Drop the trust fight. My father stays at Ashbourne. I get a generous distribution, and we all keep it out of court. It was a lot of money. I had a failing little firm and a child and a leaking roof on the cottage, and for one evening I genuinely considered it. Then Maddie did the thing that decided it for me, without meaning to. She came into the kitchen for water, 11 years old, in Daniel's old band t-shirt that she'd claimed and that hung to her knees, and she saw all the boxes and the legal pad, and she said, "Is Grandpa Gerald trying to take Della's house?" I said it was complicated. She thought about that, the serious little nod, and she said, "He told me at the funeral that you were going to lose the cottage because you're not good with money." She said it carefully, watching me, the way kids do when they're trying to figure out which adult is lying to them. Is that true? And I looked at my daughter, who had Daniel's laugh and my stubbornness, and was already learning, at 11, the family lesson that Claire is the one who isn't good enough. And I understood that the settlement wasn't about the money or the house at all. It was about whether Maddie was going to grow up in a world where the loud, charming, dishonest people win, and the quiet, careful, honest ones are taught to be grateful for scraps. I was not going to teach her that. I'd been taught that, and it had cost me 30 years. I knelt down in front of her in my pajamas at 10 o'clock at night, and I said, "Baby, I am very good with money. I'm one of the best in this whole city, and I'm going to show you exactly what that looks like." She didn't fully understand, but she nodded, and she went to bed, and I turned off the settlement in my head like a light, and I went back to work. The night before the hearing, I drove out to St. Lawrence Cemetery and sat by my grandmother's grave in the dark. The headstone was new, the dirt still settling. And I'll tell you the one thing I let myself feel that whole month, the single crack in the calm, because the rest of the time I was a woman building a case, and you can't cry and read a wire transfer at the same time. I put my hand on the cold granite and I said out loud, "I'm scared, Della." And then I cried. Just for a few minutes. Not the loud kind. The kind that just leaks out of you sideways when you've been holding your breath for 30 days. I cried for her, and for Daniel, and for the 19-year-old who believed her father when he said she'd never amount to anything but moving decimal points around. Then I wiped my face, and I drove home, and I laid my clothes out for court. The hearing was on a Tuesday in August in the probate court of Charleston County in front of Judge Eleanor Whitford, a small, sharp woman with 30 years on the bench and absolutely no patience for theater. This was technically my father's hearing. He had petitioned to be appointed personal representative of the estate and to set aside the trust on the grounds that Della had lacked capacity and had been subjected to undue influence by me. So he went first, and he was magnificent, in the way a man is magnificent right before a building falls on him. He took the stand in a beautiful navy suit. He was warm with the judge. He was wounded and reasonable, and so very sad about his poor declining mother. And then his attorney, Roland, asked him to help the court understand the family dynamics. And my father turned and looked at me sitting at the trust's table beside Francis, and he reached for the knife he'd been sharpening my whole life. "Your Honor, I'll be blunt, because my mother deserves the truth," he said. "My daughter Claire is a bookkeeper, a small-time one. Her little firm has been on the edge of failing for years. She's a widow, she couldn't keep her own house, and 4 years ago she moved herself and her child onto my mother's property and made herself indispensable to a lonely old woman." He shook his head, sorrowful. "She drove mother to appointments. She handled mother's mail. She isolated her from the rest of us. And somewhere in there, this trust appears, leaving everything to surprise Claire." He let out a small, sad laugh. "She moves decimal points around for a living, Your Honor. She knows exactly how to make numbers say whatever she wants. I'm not even angry at her. I pity her. But I won't let her steal my family's legacy with a forged piece of paper." He said forged. He looked right at me when he said it. "And I want you to understand." I felt the whole room turn to look at me. 19 people. The reporter, writing fast. Spencer, staring at his cufflinks. I felt the old heat climb up my neck. "Don't be dramatic, Claire." I didn't move. I didn't speak. I let him finish, because Francis had taught me the most important thing about a courtroom, which is that the person who is calm when everyone expects them to break is the person the judge starts to believe. Then it was our turn. Francis stood up. She is small, and she is 70-something, and she did not raise her voice once. "Your Honor," she said, "the petitioner has used the word forged 3 times this morning. We'd like to take him up on it. The trust will speak for itself, but first I'd ask the court's indulgence to call a witness who can address the petitioner's central claim, that the 2009 trust is the product of a confused, declining woman, because the trust was not signed in 2024, when Mr. Hale says his mother had lost herself. It was signed in March of 2009. And I have here the contemporaneous opinions of 2 physicians, the affidavit of the notary, and my own testimony as drafting counsel, all establishing that Adelaide Hale was, in 2009, of completely sound mind. She entered the trust into evidence, all 81 pages, and she walked the judge, slowly, to the provision that mattered. "Your Honor, the petitioner has come before this court asking to be appointed to manage and to sell an estate. There is a foundational problem with that request." She paused. "Mr. Hale does not own the estate. He has never owned the estate. As of March 2009, Ashburn and the controlling interest in Hale Land and Title Company have been owned by this irrevocable trust. Mr. Hale holds a life estate, a right to reside, and a stipend. Nothing more. He cannot sell what he does not own. He cannot encumber what he does not own. And the successor trustee and primary beneficiary of this trust, Your Honor, named 17 years ago by Adelaide Hale herself, is the woman the petitioner just called a bookkeeper, his daughter, Claire." I watched my father's face. I had waited 47 years to see his face fold, and I will be honest with you. When it finally happened, it didn't feel the way I'd imagined. It wasn't sweet. It was just true. The color went out of him. His mouth opened and nothing came out. He turned to Roland, and Roland was very busy looking at his own legal pad. That's not possible," my father said, to no one. She was senile. She didn't know what she was. In 2009, Judge Whitford said dryly. Mr. Hale, your mother was running a company in 2009. Sit down. He sat down. And then Francis said, Your Honor, the petitioner raised the question of forgery. We agree it's the central question. We'd simply like to direct the court to a different document. And she nodded to me. This was the part I'd built for 3 weeks at my kitchen table. Francis had resigned as trustee that morning, on schedule, which made me the trustee, which gave me standing to speak. I stood up. My hands were cold. They always are. I let them be cold. I laid it out the way I'd laid out the legal pad in the dark. No drama, just the receipt. I entered the $2.4 million promissory note. I entered Dr. Okonkwo's written opinion that the signature on it was not Adelaide Hale's. I entered Marcus Webb's sworn statement that the trust had never authorized any loan against Ashburn and could not have, because my father had no authority to pledge the property. I put up the timeline. I traced the money out of the company through Palmetto Coastal Holdings, registered agent Roland Price, who I watched go a remarkable shade of gray, and into my father's personal debts, my brother's failed venture, and an $800,000 consulting fee paid to Ard Tidewater Development Partners, the developer my father was secretly negotiating to sell the trust's land to. And then I played the recording. My father's own voice, warm and certain, filling that quiet courtroom. Good girl. Smart girl. The less you poke around in the company's books, the better for everybody. Just stay in your lane and there'll be something in it for you. When it ended, you could have heard the ceiling fan turn. I counted the room again, the way I do. 19 people. Same as the day he'd called me a fraud. But they weren't looking at me anymore. Every one of them was looking at my father. The reporter had stopped writing and was just watching, pen still in the air. 2 of my father's friends from the club, men who'd laughed at his decimal points jokes for 30 years, were studying the floor. One of them quietly got up and left. Spencer had finally stopped looking at his cufflinks. He was staring at our father with an expression I'd never seen on him before. Something between horror and a kind of dawning, and I realized he was doing the math too. The $800,000 the venture dad had rescued him with, where that money had actually come from. He looked like a man watching a house he'd been living in turn out to be on fire. My father tried to bluff. She edited that. She's an accountant. She knows how to. It's a complete unedited recording, and I'll provide the original file and metadata to the court and to the solicitor, I said. My voice did not shake. That surprised me more than it surprised him. He tried to negotiate. Your Honor, this is a family matter. There's no need to involve. Surely we can resolve this privately, as a family. You forged your mother's signature on a $2.4 million note, Mr. Hale, Judge Whitford said, against a property you do not own, to fund a sale you had no authority to make. That stopped being a family matter the moment it became a felony. He tried to deny it. And then, finally, he did the thing I'd watched him do my whole life when he was caught. He turned on the nearest target, which was me. He stood up, and the charm was completely gone now, and what was underneath it was just an old, frightened, furious man. You ungrateful little, after everything this family gave you, Mr. Hale, the judge warned. But I was already standing. And for the first time in 47 years, I let myself be heard in front of him. I didn't shout. I want you to know that. I have learned that the quietest voice in the room is the one everybody leans in to hear. You're right about one thing, Dad, I said. I move decimal points around for a living. I read the boring math. I notice when a number is in the wrong place. I looked at him. Grandma noticed too. That's the whole thing you never understood about her, and about me. You thought being quiet meant being weak. You spent 47 years telling everyone I'd never own anything that mattered. I let it sit for a second. You've been living in my house for 4 years, Dad. eating off the trust's table, driving the trust's cars. And I never once made you leave because she asked me to be patient and because some stubborn part of me kept hoping you'd turn out to be a different man than the one you are. I shook my head. You didn't lose the estate today. You stopped owning it 17 years ago, the morning your own mother decided she trusted the bean counter more than she trusted you. I just never told you. Until now. Nobody moved. My father sat back down. He didn't have a face for this. There wasn't a charming version of it. Judge Whitford denied his petition to be appointed personal representative. She denied his motion to set aside the trust, finding it valid and Adelaide Hale fully competent in 2009. She confirmed me as successor trustee, and she referred the matter of the forged promissory note, Palmetto Coastal Holdings, and the Tidewater payments to the Charleston County Solicitor's Office and the South Carolina Attorney General for criminal investigation. Then she looked at my father over her glasses, the same way Della used to, and said, Mr. Hale, as trustee, your daughter now has the authority to terminate your life estate for cause. I'd suggest you be very polite to her. And she banged the gavel and called the next case. I gathered my files. My hands had finally stopped being cold. Spencer caught up to me in the hallway, opened his mouth, and I held up one hand and he closed it. Frances put her small hand on my arm and said the only thing she said about the whole affair, which was, your grandmother would have enjoyed that enormously. Then I walked out of the courthouse into the wet Charleston heat, and I drove home, and Maddie was on the cottage porch waiting for me. And I sat down next to her on the steps, and I didn't say anything for a long time. We just watched the tide come in. 14 months later. It's October again, and the Spartina has gone gold the way it does. And I'm sitting on the big back porch at Ashbourne, the big house now, not the cottage, with a glass of sweet tea sweating on the rail and my grandmother's old Buick still parked in the carriage house because I haven't had the heart to sell it. It still runs. She'd have called me a fool to get rid of it. Let me tell you where everyone landed, because I know you've earned that, my father pleaded out. The forgery and the self-dealing were not really fightable once they were laid end to end, and his expensive attorney, Roland Price, who got himself disbarred for his trouble, was suddenly very interested in cooperating to save his own skin. Gerald avoided prison, barely, in exchange for full restitution and a felony conviction. Restitution meant the loan got unwound and the $2.4 million came back to the company, which is to say back to the trust, which is to say it came home. He lives now in a rented condo off Folly Road. He no longer has the membership or the standing reservation or the brass plate. The last I heard, he tells people at the marina that he's stepped back from the business to focus on family. Which is the kind of thing my father will be saying with a straight face until the day he dies. I terminated his life estate. I'll be honest, I thought about it for a long time. In the end, I didn't do it out of cruelty. I did it because a man who forges his mother's name to sell her marsh out from under her has paid the rent on that house in full, and there's none left. He'll send word every so often, through Spencer, that he'd like to talk. The door is closed. I'm at peace with that. Forgiveness, I've learned, is something you can hand someone without ever once handing them your keys back. Spencer is complicated. He wasn't charged. He was reckless and entitled, but he wasn't the one holding the pen. And I believe that. We don't talk much. But on Maddie's 12th birthday, a card showed up in the mail. No money in it this time, just a long handwritten note that said he was sorry. And that he'd watched our father do this to me my whole life, and never once said anything, and that he was ashamed of that. It wasn't enough. It was real, though. I let Maddie answer it. I'm letting the door be open exactly a crack on my terms, and we'll see. Some bridges you don't rebuild. Some you just leave the lights on near, in case. The company is doing better than it has in a decade, mostly because the person running it now reads the balance sheet. I kept the name, Hale Land and Title, because it's a good name and I earned it. But the first thing I did as trustee was the thing Della spent 30 years trying to protect. I put the entire Ashbourne Marsh acreage, all 412 acres of it, under a permanent conservation easement with the Low Country Land Trust she used to quietly fund. No developer will ever touch it. The Herons can have it forever. I signed the easement with her fountain pen, and I started a fund. It's small, for now. It's called the Adelaide Hale Fund, and it gives a little money, no paperwork required, no business plan to be laughed at, to women starting over after a loss, a divorce, a death, a betrayal, who have a quiet plan and no one in their family who'll believe in it. Daniel's name is on it, too. The first grant we gave was to a widow in North Charleston opening a little bakery. She cried. I cried. We didn't make it weird about it. The brass key sits in a small frame on the mantel in the front hall now, under the oil portrait of old Augustus Hale, who I suspect would have had opinions about a woman running things. I look at it most mornings. I keep it there to remember the most important thing my grandmother ever taught me, which she never said in so many words, but which she proved with 17 years of patience and 81 notarized pages. Being underestimated is not the same as being weak. Sometimes it's just the quietest room in the house, the one where you get to do all your real work while everyone else is busy being loud. Maddie is 12 now and getting Daniel's laugh more every year. The other night she beat me at gin rummy 3 hands running and told me I'd gone soft, and I had to leave the room for a minute because that's exactly what her great-grandmother used to say, and grief and love are the same river some days, running in 2 directions at once. She asked me last week what I do for a living because a friend's mother had asked her. I said, I notice when a number's in the wrong place, and I keep things safe until the right person needs them. She thought about that and nodded, the serious little nod she's had since she was small. That sounds important, she said. It is, baby. It turns out it always was. So let me ask you something, because I really do want to know. Have you ever been the quiet one? The one your family decided, somewhere along the way, would never amount to much. The bookkeeper. The strong one. The one who's fine. The one nobody worried about because you always landed on your feet. Tell me in the comments. Tell me what they underestimated about you and what you've been keeping safe. I read every single one, and I promise you, you are not the only person who's been sitting quiet in a loud room, holding the one thing everybody forgot to look for. And if this story stayed with you, if you believe that patience can be a kind of power and that the truth, kept safe long enough, eventually finds the daylight, then subscribe and stay with me. Because there's another story I want to tell you next week. And it's about a woman everyone in the room thought had nothing left to lose. They were wrong about that, too.